By emphasizing the recognition and the knowing of the unwholesome roots of lust, of anger, of delusion, and the wholesome ones, that is the absence of those states, the Buddha is highlighting the wise discernment between what is skillful and what is not skillful. Why is this so important? Because it's not only that these different mind states are arising in our minds, they very often are the motivation for our actions in the world. And when we look around in the world, why do we see so much avoidable suffering? There's so much violence, hunger, war, injustice. What is happening in these situations? It's people acting out unwholesome mind states of greed, of hatred, of fear. So for our own happiness and for peace in the world, we need to know what is skillful and what is unskillful. And we need to recognize these states when they arise in our minds. The Dalai Lama emphasized this point in a very beautiful and striking way when he said that actions, and I might say a very un-American way, when he said that actions should not ultimately be judged by their success or failure, but by the motivation behind them. And that's a very radical statement. That's saying that we measure the moral worth of an action not by its success or failure, but by the quality of the motivation behind them. We cannot always or even often control outcomes, but we can take responsibility for our own hearts and minds. And this is precisely what this third foundation of mindfulness is teaching us to do. So how can we know the lustful mind as being lustful, and one without lust as being without lust? And similarly for ill will or anger and delusion. There's a verse in the Dhammapada, that wonderful collection of teachings in verse form, that describes very succinctly how these different unwholesome roots of mind manifest. So it's kind of a pointer to what we can look for. This verse says, "There is no fire like lust, no grip like anger, no net like delusion." There is no fire like lust, no grip like anger, no net like delusion. So in practicing mindfulness of the mind, we need to see for ourselves, and this is our own direct investigation, how we are experiencing these states in our own minds. How do they manifest? We might feel the feverish excitability of lust. There is that kind of feverish quality to it when the mind is filled with lust. We might feel the contraction, the heaviness, the tightness, the alienation when the mind is filled with anger or aversion or hatred. We might feel confusion, the confused entanglement of delusion. Buddhadasa, he was one of the great Thai masters of the last century, he described the manifestation of these three unwholesome roots in another way. He described the tendency towards lust or desire as pulling in, and the tendency towards aversion as pushing away. And my favorite is describing delusion as running around in circles. And it's just that you can just picture the mind just doing that. So that's another way, if we pay attention to the energy movement of the mind. We might feel the heat of desire, or the tightness of anger, or the confusion of delusion, or we might feel the energy movement of going towards something. We're trying to pull something in for desire, pushing away as aversion, running around in circles as delusion. And in following these instructions, we also become mindful when these states are absent. We need to notice the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, the absence of delusion, when we're not in the grip of these unwholesome roots. A very insightful place to observe this is as you become aware, as you're mindful of the mind filled with lust, for example, desire, wanting of some kind, and you're mindful and you're noting and you're noting and you're noting, pay particular attention to the moment when that mind state disappears. It's there, it's there, it's there, and at a certain point, it's not there. Right in that moment of transition, there's a tremendous illumination of the mind free of lust, free of desire. We have that contrast which is so vivid in that moment. And it is the feeling of being let out of the grip of something. For some reason, though, we seem to have a greater fascination with the difficulties. It's a neurotic fascination, I think. But somehow it's easier for us to focus on what's difficult in our practice. And we often overlook the presence of the unwholesome states of mind. And of course, this becomes a major contribution to how we view ourselves. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha is very explicitly giving equal importance, mindfulness when the unskillful states are there, mindful when the skillful states are there, which often we experience as the absence of the unskillful. So don't overlook that. As we practice recognizing each of these states and how they are manifesting in our experience and naming them as a way, using the noting, as a way of really framing them, as our recognition becomes clearer, as the perception of them become clearer, it's like putting a frame around the experience so then we can become mindful of the experience in a deeper way, free of words, free of concepts. And this move is described very well in some lines by the author Michael Cunningham in the book The Hours, where he says, everything in the world has its own secret name, a name that cannot be conveyed in language, but is simply the sight and the feel of the thing itself. And I love that, the secret name of things that cannot be conveyed in language, in words, but is simply the sight and the feel of the thing itself. That's mindfulness. So we recognize this is the lustful mind, this is the angry mind, this is the deluded mind, or absent of those states. But then we simply use those concepts, those words, to then drop in directly to the experience. Now these instructions to know whether the wholesome roots are present or the unwholesome roots are present, the Buddha is pointing something out which is quite central on this path of freedom. Because by implication, what the Buddha is saying here is that these kilesas, these unwholesome roots, because they are not always present, are what is called adventitious. That's not a usual word in English. What adventitious means is something that is not inherent or not innate. So the Buddha is saying here, these unwholesome roots of greed, of hatred, delusion, and all their manifestations are not inherent to the mind. They are not innate to the mind. They are not the nature of the mind itself. They come as visitors when the different conditions for their arising arise. And there's quite a well-known teaching on this, where the Buddha said, "The mind, O bhikkhus, is luminous. It is clouded by visiting defilements. The mind, O bhikkhus, is luminous. It is freed from visiting defilements." So this understanding that the unwholesome roots are not innate to the mind suggests a very different attitude in working with these states when they arise than the way we usually revert to. So instead of drowning in the greed or the desire or the anger or the aversion or the delusion, instead of drowning in them or judging them or denying them, what the Buddha is saying, simply be mindful. Be mindful when they're present. Be mindful when they're not present. It's amazingly direct. Instead of reacting, instead of judging, instead of fighting with, the Buddha is saying, one knows when these are present, one knows when these are not present. But as my teacher, my first teacher, Munindraji, would often say about practice, this is very simple, but it's not easy. It's simple, but not easy. You know, for so many years, I would struggle with the difficulties in my practice, thinking that I was a bad yogi whenever the defilements would arise in my mind. You know, I couldn't concentrate. So I would have all of these judgments about it. Even in more intense times of psychological dismay, you know, especially in those times when I was working with intense fear, I just started seeing myself as this total psychological catastrophe. You know, and thinking, this is going to need 30 years of therapy to unwind. It took a while in being with these different difficult, unwholesome states of mind. It took a while to actually follow the Buddha's teachings, because the habit of reaction, the habit of judgment, self-judgment, was so strong. What the Buddha is saying is that these difficult mind states are not in themselves a problem or a mistake, but are simply part of the path. When we're mindful, the mind is like this, it's like this, it's like this. We begin to see their ephemeral, impermanent, empty nature. So when I began to see this and not judge myself for these kilesas that were arising, there was actually a certain joy that came into my practice. You know, I would see one of these defilements and it was almost a smile, because I realized deeply that I would much rather see and explore them than not see them and simply act them out. So the clear seeing, even of the unwholesome states, brought a certain level of joy and a tremendous amount of interest in the practice.